Okay, so here we are, fragmentation, corridors, connectivity, part two. The other thing I didn't mention about this slide here is Jim Quinn and Susan Harrison here on this campus have also done some of these experiments, and so you can and have a couple of particularly well-cited papers on this one, looking at metapopulations, and the other one looking at fragmentation and isolation on species richness. Okay, so here's the idea of a metapopulation, if you haven't had this in other classes, is that up in the upper left is this classic Levin's model. Levin's did basically a mathematical model, no pictures, but the idea is that if you have populations that are semi-isolated, populations that may themselves go extinct, but if there is some small degree of migration of individuals from one patch to another, that you can rescue these patches by through an extinction immigration pattern that repopulates patches as after they empty out. And that's a classic metapopulation model, and it increases overall population persistence quite dramatically. Now, in looking at this, people like I've made this point before about the arc of enthusiasm on different things, and there was a while in which everyone thought, well, clearly they're dealing with metapopulations, and what they need to do is build a little bit of connectivity in to allow movement of individuals back and forth. A decade of research on this really, I think, put the nails in the coffin of this and suggested that more often than not, we're dealing with the second in the middle diagram on the top, mainland island populations, where these mainlands are big reservoirs of populations, and that you have smaller isolated or semi-isolated peripheral populations, and that they may be recolonized and they may go extinct, but at the end of the day, their fates is linked to whatever happens to the mainland population, that the islands aren't sufficient to maintain the mainland, and that really the conservation of the mainland is the big deal. Or you have something like a patchy population where you have individual patches, that populations come in, isolated patches. But if there is an abundance of movement, like many individuals every season, then it's just a patchy population. And that, again, it's likely to behave as one wildlife thing rather than these metapopulations in the Levin sense, because they are always moving individuals around, and they all tend to have the same kind of fate. Down in the lower left, you see something that is called a non-equilibrium metapopulation. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but you see they're isolated patches that have no connection whatsoever, and so they're all these patches then that are pretty much on their own accord, that they succeed or fail, independent of the other patches, and lacking movement of individuals back and forth. There's no metapopulation dynamics here. And of course, then the lower right, you can have any kind of intermediate case in between. And so just demonstrating that you actually have a metapopulation has become very difficult. And as a consequence, there's a little bit less enthusiasm. There's no less enthusiasm on the idea that a metapopulation can have a stabilizing effect on patchy populations. It's just less enthusiasm in terms of trying to argue that that's really the dynamic that's going on in many cases. So another way in which people think about corridors and thinking about the need for corridors is that there are these organisms that have these massive migration pathways. Elephants migrate long distances. The wildebeest migration from the Serengeti up to the Masai Mara and back down again, and the degree to which they have to cross rivers and get eaten by crocodiles make for great nature videos, and a very famous case. But those kinds of cases are all over the place, with lots of caribou on the north slope of North America that move long distances every year, and that maintaining habitat connectivity is important for the stability of those populations. But even things like pronghorn and bison in the Wyoming-Montana area, that the Wildlife Conservation Society in North America has been very concerned about fenceless areas and maintaining the capacity for these organisms to migrate seasonally, to get all the habitats that they need to make it through their life cycle from year in and year out. And so this is an avenue for connectivity. Another one is this idea of changing climates and connectivity. the Yale framework, as it's been called. There's a group of people working. Oz Schmitz from Yale has been one of the leaders of this. That there are different efforts that you can make to try and increase resilience of landscapes for future changes, and that these things include protect the current patterns of biodiversity, protect large intact natural landscapes, protect the geophysical setting, identify and protect future climate space, and then protect climate refugia, and then down at the bottom, maintain and establish ecological connectivity between these patches. And so if you go on to a database in one of these repositories for conservation information, you see conservation corridor connecting science to conservation. There's the Yale framework programs and tools. Here's a group of the people working on the Yale framework standing around someplace. The person with the blue jean shirt on there with the white hair, that's Paul Beyer, who has worked for a long time on corridors with mountain lions. And so this has been a big area for thinking about connectivity, is thinking about climate change and the idea of building resilient landscapes for the future by protecting places that where things live now to where they may live in the future. I should mention in here that Paul Beyer, who has thought a lot about corridors, got into this probably for the main reason of thinking about intact whole ecosystems, and this idea that if you have a fragmented landscape, that maintaining some corridors and connectivity allows things like mountain lions to have their ecologically relevant role in all the semi-isolated patches that would otherwise lack mountain lions. And so another attribute for thinking corridors are important are to maintain the ecosystem function of top predators in otherwise isolated fragments. But this whole concept of connectivity has been used for lots of different reasons, and it's because it's a very deeply embedded process or idea, sorry, in conservation. So this map is a proposed Chicago wilderness map. That's Lake Michigan in the blue there, and of course the pink star offshore there is not far from the downtown sector of Chicago, and or I guess it's maybe a little further south. But anyway, there's the third largest city of North America embedded in this landscape, and yet Chicago has been one of these areas where they have done a really good job of having an integrated conservation program that now spans across 4 states. So that's Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, and tries to envision a landscape where you have connections for wildlife all the way around this major metropolitan area to maintain that wild, or a sense of an actuality of wild habitats for the people of the Chicago region and the species that live there, and that they are trying to build a connected map. And I should say that this builds off of the Forest Reserve Network that the city of Chicago did, which in itself is a relatively relatively large amount of attention to connectivity and green belting around the city of Chicago. So an associated concern is this idea of roads as barriers, that there's a lot of information that has piled up about mortality of stuff on roads, and that an idea that is now often used as a management tool is to build in connectivity for wildlife. And so here are some examples. There's in southern Illinois, there's a road that's closed seasonally because snakes migrate across it in order to for mating, and that then there's lots of people go down there to watch the snakes cross the roads. But it's called Snake Road, and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources makes a special effort to tend to the snakes so that it reduces the mortality of snakes on the road by cars. The central set of pictures is Lake Jackson in northern Florida, where they're building these barriers and so that they can try and direct wildlife, in this case mostly turtles, to move through safe corridors and not wander across the road and get hit by cars. going up and down this road that runs up to Thomasville, Georgia. And the pictures on the right, I think, are both from the Rocky Mountains. One's in Alberta, and I'm not sure where the grizzly bear picture is. But in both cases, they're either building underpasses or overpasses that try and facilitate and foster the capacity of wildlife to move across roads without endanger to people. And so this has been one of the other areas that people have been very concerned about and have been thinking about corridors and fragmentation. But the hard part of this, and the part that is going to be actually more interesting, is this idea of shifting from this bland notion of a corridor, of just connecting land cover types on a map, and to really figuring out what it is that the organisms are doing, how they move, and what they move through and what they don't move through. As I think was alluded to in the disease lecture, is that when you build connectivity, it's not just the good things that move down those corridors, it's also the bad things that move down those corridors: diseases, pests, pathogens, invasive species in some cases. And so there's plenty of empirical evidence that suggests both good things and bad things about building corridors. And so it really speaks to this issue of taking a little bit more care about thinking about why it is that you want connectivity. And this example that's on this slide is from Cheryl Schultz, who's worked on the Fender's Blue in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And so the map all the way on the right is a map of these populations of the Fender's Blue. And the idea is that it's probably, it's a butterfly, it flies around, it doesn't probably need absolute connectivity, and that buying, it lives down in the lowland, more agricultural areas, and purchasing corridors to connect all these dots together would be ridiculously and prohibitively expensive. And yet the Fender's Blue is a species of concern, and it's declining. And so the idea is, can you work to build a conservation strategy that increases the capacity of organisms to persist, either through some sort of metapopulation dynamics, or and in this case they're looking at this idea of stepping stone patches to allow some amount of movement from one place to another. And that movement may be because you want to keep a genetic interchange of populations, or you want to create that population stability so that if bad things happen on patch A, there's some movement from patch B to patch A, and allows that population as a whole to thrive better. Okay, so I'm going to leave that off because that's about where Ryan and Matt will take it up and think about connectivity. But I have here a couple of slides that go through some of this critical literature that has led to this thinking about fragmentation and corridors over the years. There's a number of papers by Paul Beyer. Do habitat corridors provide connectivity? Choices and procedures for designing wildlife linkages towards best practices, a checklist for evaluating impacts and movement corridors, a real practical approach to thinking about corridors. Graham Cawley, I will harken back to this paper quite a lot, that he thought about connectivity as well as population viability assessment back in '94, as a classic paper in conservation. Deb Dubinsky here in 2000 did this review with Holt on habitat fragmentation experiments. Lenore Farig, 94, 97, a couple classic papers on fragmentation in populations. Hansky, the king of metapopulation dynamics and metapopulation theory. Dennis Saunders and this biological consequences of ecosystem fragmentation review. And then a couple of papers by Cheryl Schultz. And with that, I think I'm going to leave it off. That's almost a half an hour, guys, on this one. And it'll probably be about the same length that I'll try and post up on Wednesday for Thursday's class. All right, see you Tuesday.